Okay, so let's unpack this. We often talk about these, really complex metabolic cycles, but most of the energy that's powering your brain right now, the foundational fuel for your cells, it really all begins with a simple sugar, with glucose.
That's our mission today. We are taking a deep dive into the absolute foundation of biological energy production. We're talking about glycolysis and then that critical next step, the oxidation of pyruvate.
And our source material here is a core chapter from biochemistry, which really lays out the metabolic blueprint that, every living cell relies on.
Exactly. Our goal is to distill how cells process glucose into usable energy, ATP. But I think more importantly, it's to understand the central tension in this pathway.
Which is?
The difference between aerobic survival when you have plenty of oxygen and the kind of, well, the desperate strategies of anaerobic survival when oxygen is scarce.
And this pathway is so much more than just an academic exercise. The biomedical stakes are incredibly high.
They are. Just think about the brain. It's a glucose glutton. Even if you're in a prolonged fast, it can only cover about, 20% of its energy demand using other things like ketone bodies.
So this pathway happening in the cytosol of all your cells is just central to human health.
It is. So if the brain and every other cell depend on this, why is understanding the regulation, the stops and starts of glycolysis, so essential?
Because when that regulation fails, things go wrong fast.
That's it. Understanding the controls is the key to grasping things like hemolytic anemia, which often traces right back to specific enzyme deficiencies in your red blood cells.
And it explains things like the metabolic drain of cancer cachexia.
That's linked to this inefficient energy recycling.
Mm.
And it illuminates the lethal risk of lactic acidosis, which is a huge signal of failure in pyruvate metabolism.
That sets the stage perfectly. So let's start at the very beginning, glycolysis itself.
Right. So glycolysis is defined as the main pathway for glucose metabolism. And crucially, it all happens in the cytosol, so outside the mitochondria.
And what's so cool is its adaptability. It's like a dual fuel system. It can serve energy needs whether oxygen is around or not.
Exactly. Its operational mode, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, is basically determined by two things. Is there enough oxygen? And are there functioning mitochondria available to run the electron transport chain?
A perfect example of that forced anaerobic survival has to be the red blood cell, right? The erythrocyte.
It's the ultimate glycolytic machine. Erythrocytes completely lack mitochondria.
So they can't use oxygen at all.
Not at all. Meaning they are perpetually 100% reliant on glucose and specifically anaerobic glycolysis for every single bit of ATP they produce.
That anaerobic capacity, it seems like a massive adaptive advantage for any tissue that's facing a crisis.
It's a temporary lifeline. It really is.
Right.
Glycolysis allows tissues, especially fast-twitch skeletal muscle, during, say, intense exercise.
Like a sprint.
Exactly, a sprint.
Right.
It lets them produce ATP really fast, even when oxygen supply is lagging behind. This helps tissues survive these short anoxic periods.
But the trade-off, the metabolic inefficiency, it's just staggering.
The cost is enormous. Anaerobic glycolysis only gives you a net of 2 ATP per mole of glucose. If that pyruvate gets fully oxidized in the mitochondria aerobically,
The yield is much greater.
oh, way greater. You're looking at up to 32 ATP per mole, assuming you're using the efficient mallet shuttle. You sacrifice over 90% of your energy potential just to stay alive in an oxygen-starved environment.
And the overall equation tells that story so clearly. Under anaerobic conditions, the net reaction is glucose plus 2 ADP plus 2 inorganic phosphate yields 2 lactate, 2 net ATP, and 2 water. So how does a cell commit? What's the first step?
The first step is the gatekeeper. Glucose has to be irreversibly phosphorylated to glucose 6-phosphate, or G6P. This reaction is handled by an enzyme called hexokinase, and it uses up 1 ATP.
And in most tissues, hexokinase is tightly controlled right there.
It is. It's allosterically inhibited by its own product, G6P. So if G6P starts to build up, the pathway just hits the brakes.
Which keeps things steady. But that brings us to a really crucial metabolic split. The difference between hexokinase and its cousin, glucokinase.
Yes, which you find in the liver and the pancreas. And the logic here is just beautiful. Hexokinase, say, in your muscles has a really high affinity for glucose, a low K number.
Meaning it's always working at near max speed.
Right, even when blood glucose is low. Its job is just to make sure that cell gets the glucose it needs no matter what. And insulin generally controls the transport of glucose into these cells.
But glucokinase in the liver is a completely different story. It has a systemic job, not a local one.
Precisely. Glucokinase has a much lower affinity, a high K number.
Yeah.
It only really gets going when Glucose concentration in the portal vein is massively elevated, like right after a big carb-heavy meal.
So the liver is acting like a glucose buffer.
It's mopping it up. Glucokinase lets the liver pull in huge amounts of excess glucose to store as glycogen or, turn into fat.
And in the pancreas, that low affinity turns the enzyme into a perfect sensor.
Absolutely. In the pancreatic beta islet cells, glucokinase senses that rush of post-meal glucose. When it detects high glucose, it ramps up glycolysis, which increases the amount of ATP in the cell.
And that ATP is the signal.
That's the signal. The increased ATP closes a specific potassium channel that depolarizes the cell membrane, which triggers calcium to rush in, and that calcium surge is what finally triggers the release of insulin. It's this beautiful molecular cascade.
Okay, so we've passed that first checkpoint. We've made glucose 6-phosphate, which then becomes fructose 6-phosphate, and then we hit the main regulatory choke point of the whole pathway.
That's reaction 3. The conversion of fructose 6-phosphate to fructose 1-6-bisphosphate. This is done by phosphofructokinase 1, or PFK1. This is the second irreversible step, and it is the committed rate-limiting step for all of glycolysis.
This is the real decision point. If the cell is going to invest in glycolysis, PFK1 is where it happens. Why this step? Why is it so much more heavily regulated?
Because it controls the commitment. Once you make fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, there's really no going back. So PFK1 is controlled by the energy state of the cell.
Right, so high ATP inhibits it?
High ATP and also high citrate.
Citrate is fascinating because that's a signal from the mitochondria.
Yes, citrate is an intermediate in the citric acid cycle. If citrate levels are high, it backs up into the cytosol and basically tells PFK1, hey, stop sending fuel, we're full, we can't process what we have.
Okay, so that's what turns it off. What flips the switch on? What signals a massive need for energy?
The most potent activator is a molecule called fructose 2.6-bisphosphate. Now that's 2,6, not 1,6, which is the product.
A different molecule entirely.
Right. Fructose 226-bisphosphate is made by a different bifunctional enzyme called PFK2. And when insulin is high, it activates the PFK2 part of that enzyme, which makes F26BP, which then powerfully turns on PFK1.
So high insulin means go, break down that glucose fast.
That's the signal. Once PFK1 does its job, the fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is split by aldolase into 2 3-carbon sugars. So now we have 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P, moving forward.
And now we're ready to generate some power.
This is where the payoff phase begins, specifically with the G3P dehydrogenase step. This is an NAD-dependent oxidation that leads right into our first ATP-generating reaction.
Can you walk us through the mechanics of that oxidation? It has a pretty unique intermediate.
It does. The enzyme works using a thiol ester. The G3P substrate binds to a cysteine residue in the enzyme's active site, forming a high-energy intermediate. This is then oxidized, passing hydrogens to NAD+.
And only then does the phosphate come in.
Only after the oxidation.
Yeah.
Then inorganic phosphate is added to form the final product, 1,4,3-bisphosphoglycerate.
And that specific mechanism is exactly where arsenic becomes so toxic.
That's the critical connection. Arsenate looks a lot like inorganic phosphate, so it competes directly in this step. But when arsenate gets incorporated, the molecule it forms just spontaneously hydrolyzes.
Which bypasses the whole point.
It bypasses the entire ATP-generating step. You've done the oxidation, you've used up the substrate, but you get zero energy out of it. It's a complete failure of energy conservation.
So, assuming no arsenic, the next reaction is our first ATP payout.
Reaction 7, catalyzed by phosphoglycerate kinase. This is our first site of what we call substrate-level phosphorylation. That high-energy phosphate from 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate is transferred directly to ADP.
Yielding 1 ATP per molecule, so 2 net ATP per glucose at this point.
Exactly.
That brings us to the final stages. The molecule gets rearranged a bit and then dehydrated by an enzyme called enolase to form a really high-energy intermediate, phosphenyl pyruvate, or PP.
Right, and enolase is important clinically because it requires magnesium or manganese to function, and it's inhibited by fluoride.
And that explains why blood samples for glucose tests are collected in the large fluoride-containing tubes.
Exactly. The fluoride stops enolase dead in its tracks, right there in the tube. It prevents the red blood cells from continuing glycolysis and artificially lowering the glucose reading before it can be measured.
So that PEP finally leads to our second and final ATP-generating step.
Reaction 10. This is catalyzed by pyruvate kinase. It's the final irreversible step, and it gives you another 2 net ATP per glucose.
So now we have pyruvate, and the cell has to make its central decision. Is there oxygen or not?
That's the fork in the road. The availability of oxygen determines the fate of pyruvate. Under anaerobic conditions, say when your muscle is working so hard the respiratory chain is backed up, the cell faces a crisis.
The NAD plus needed for glycolysis is all stuck as NADH.
Exactly. So NAD plus has to be regenerated for glycolysis to continue at all.
And that's the job of lactate dehydrogenase.
That is its primary purpose. LDH reduces pyruvate to lactate, and in doing so, it oxidizes NADH back to NAD+. This allows glycolysis to keep churning out that essential 2 ATP per glucose to keep the cell going.
And lactate isn't just a waste product of exercise. It's a crucial metabolic carrier for a lot of tissues.
That's right. Lactate is the constant end product for tissues that either lack mitochondria, like red blood cells, or are poorly vascularized, like parts of the kidney, the retina, and of course, actively firing skeletal muscle.
Which brings us back to that important clinical link with cancer metabolism, the Warburg effect.
Right. In fast-growing cancer cells, even with oxygen around, glycolysis just runs at this incredibly accelerated rate. Pyruvate is rapidly turned into lactate and then pumped out of the cell.
And this ties directly into the debilitating symptoms of cancer cachexia.
It does. That lactate produced by the tumor travels through the blood to the liver. The liver then has to expend a huge amount of energy to turn it back into glucose through gluconeogenesis.
It's a futile cycle.
It's an incredibly energy-draining cycle of lactate production and recycling, and it's a major cause of the hypermetabolism we see in cancer cachexia.
But if oxygen is available, pyruvate takes a different path. It leaves the cytosol and heads for the mitochondria.
It's transported into the mitochondrial matrix by a proton importer, and the NADH that was generated at the cytosol also gets its reducing power into the mitochondria using shuttle systems.
And once it's inside the matrix, pyruvate has to pass through one final crucial gateway before it can enter the citric acid cycle.
That gateway is the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, or PDH. This is a massive, highly regulated multi-enzyme machine that catalyzes the irreversible oxidative decarboxylation of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA.
The overall reaction is pretty straightforward. Pyruvate plus NAD plus and coenzyme A gives you acetyl-CoA, NADH, a proton, and CO2. And the function of this complex requires an essential vitamin.
Thiamine. Specifically thiamine diphosphate, which comes from vitamin B1. It's absolutely essential. The reaction starts when pyruvate is decarboxylated right onto this enzyme-bound TDP.
And given that PDH is the irreversible point of no return for carbohydrates, I mean, once they become acetyl-CoA, they can't go back to being glucose?
Yeah.
It must be under some really strict regulation.
Oh, it is. And the regulation is all about metabolic efficiency. First, it's inhibited directly by its own products, acetyl-CoA and NADH. If you have too much product, the enzyme just slows down.
And then there's a second, more nuanced layer of control, the covalent modification system.
This is the key layer of metabolic intelligence. PDH activity is decreased when it gets phosphorylated by an enzyme called PDH kinase. And this kinase is strongly activated by high energy ratios.
So high ATP to ADP, high acetyl-CoA to CoA.
And high NADH to NAD+. Basically, when the cell is rich in energy, PDH gets shut off.
What's the purpose of shutting it down when acetyl-CoA is high?
It's about carbohydrate sparing. High acetyl-CoA often comes from breaking down fatty acids. So when you're burning a lot of fat, the resulting acetyl-CoA and NADH activate PDH kinase, which inactivates PDH. This ensures that your cell preferentially burns fat for energy and saves that precious glucose for tissues like the brain that absolutely need it.
And how do you turn it back on?
There's a PDH phosphatase that removes the phosphate group, activating the complex. It gets activated by things like magnesium and calcium. And interestingly, insulin also activates PDH in fat tissue to make sure that excess carbohydrate can be efficiently converted into acetyl-CoA for fat synthesis.
Which means failures here have immediate and severe clinical consequences, often leading to lactic acidosis.
Absolutely. If you impair pyruvate metabolism, both pyruvate and lactates start to accumulate. This can be caused by inhibition of PDH by heavy metals or, critically, by a deficiency of thiamine.
Vitamin B1, which is something you see frequently in chronic alcoholism.
Yes, due to poor diet and inhibited absorption. This deficiency can lead to a rapid, life-threatening buildup of pyruvic and lactic acid. An inherited PDH deficiency is also a very grave condition, causing severe neurological problems because the brain just can't get the energy it needs from glucose.
And beyond PDH, deficiencies in the glycolytic enzymes themselves can also cause disease.
Of course. Inherited deficiencies in enzymes like pyruvate kinase in red blood cells cause hemolytic anemia. The cells can't make enough ATP to maintain their structure, so they get destroyed prematurely. Separately, a deficiency in muscle PFK1 leads to a very low tolerance for exercise, especially after a high-carb meal.
Okay, finally, let's look at that specialized survival pathway in red blood cells, the 2-CUM3-BPG shunt.
It's a remarkable trade-off. Erythrocytes can divert the molecule 1-copper-3-bisphosphoglycerate using an enzyme to create 2-copper-3-bisphosphoglycerate, or DPG.
And this step completely bypasses that first ATP generating reaction.
It does. The cell sacrifices those two ATP.
So why do it? What's the powerful gain from that sacrifice?
The DTG that it makes binds very tightly to hemoglobin, and in doing so, it significantly decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen.
So it makes it easier for hemoglobin to let go of oxygen.
Exactly. This change encourages oxygen to be released more readily into the peripheral tissues that need it the most. The cell trades its own immediate energy for a massive advantage in systemic oxygen delivery.
That is the ultimate example of a biochemical trade-off. Okay, so let's wrap up our deep dive with the key takeaways.
First, remember glycolysis is the anaerobic lifeline, giving you 2 ATP, but it's also the critical aerobic starter, feeding into pathways that can yield up to 32 ATP. Second, the pathway is tightly controlled at 3 major irreversible gates: hexokinase glucokinase, PFK1, and pyruvate kinase.
And third, lactate isn't just waste.
Not at all. It's a critical systemic metabolite. It's constantly being recycled by the liver, playing a huge role in everything from intense exercise to cancer hypermetabolism.
All right, here's a final thought for you to consider based on that specific regulation we talked about. The source material notes that a high fructose intake can often bypass regulation and lead directly to increased fat synthesis in the liver. So given that glucokinase acts as this high common and gatekeeper for glucose, forcing the body to prioritize it for systemic needs, what is it about the entry point of fructose into the glycolytic pathway that allows it to sort of sneak past those initial crucial regulatory controls and push the cell straight into making fat?
A fascinating structural vulnerability to consider, especially in the context of the modern diet. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the engine room of cellular metabolism.